Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's really my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Neil Perry from Stanford. Neil received a BA in Computer Science, Economics, Mathematics, and Liberal Arts from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. During his time there, he was a Marshall Scholarship finalist and the university's nominee for the Churchill Scholarship. He is currently pursuing his PhD at Stanford University, where he's advised by Professor Dan Boneh, one of the world's preeminent cryptographers. At Stanford, Neil has also made significant contributions, including teaching a graduate course in cryptography. We're really lucky to have him here. So Neil's work spans a very impressive range, from developing anonymous communication systems to support protesters and oppressive regimes, to pioneering cryptographic techniques for tracking nuclear warheads in support of the non-proliferation efforts. In fact, over the last few years, we have been collaborating with Neil on the CNS Stanford Warhead Tracking Project led by Mels Pomper from the DC office and Jill Moon from Stimson. Neil's contribution to this project has been invaluable. And I really want to emphasize that. Early in the project, he presented using hash codes and zero-knowledge snark, which I think you'll probably discuss. Tools which have proven to be critical to the success of the verification protocol that we submitted last time. So I'm sure he will tell us all about it. As a Stanford Emerging Technology Review Setter Fellow at Hoover Institution, he's been a subject matter expert on cryptography. He's contributed to public policy, including developing a comprehensive report for Congress and the White House on the implications of emerging technologies. That's the Setter report, right? Which is really, really interesting, looking at 10 different technologies. He's also directly advised the White House on tech policy related to national security. In today's talk, Neil will explore the application of cryptography to several vital areas of national security. This will include discussing his work on tracking nuclear warheads, developing new policy frameworks for nuclear weapons treaties, and ensuring the security and privacy of DNA printers, and examining the impact of recent advances in AI on the security of software that underlies our corporate and national infrastructure. So please join me in welcoming Neil Perry.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very glad to be here. So I'm Neil Perry. I'm a PhD student at Stanford University, advised by Dan Boneh. And I'm here to talk about applying cryptography to other fields in a black box manner. In this case, we're talking about multiple areas of national security. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that, I guess technically, I'm a computer scientist and a cryptographer that works on many multidisciplinary things, but I'm not necessarily an expert in those other areas. In terms of specifics of arms control and national security, I think probably a lot of people in this room know way more than I do on all the details. So what I tend to do is build out kind of general abstract systems that can handle lots of different uses. And then I rely on other people like Dan Zukov or Rose Gadamoller to take my things and apply them to specific narrow use cases. But because of that, if anybody wants to ask questions or fill in details or anything like that, people should just interrupt me throughout this talk. This can be a very interactive thing. We don't have to wait for all the Q&A stuff at the end, especially since there could be mismatches in terms of me not knowing details, certain things that you guys work on, or maybe I think that something's clear for like a math or computer science thing and it's not. People should just interrupt me and let me know, and we can take a step back and fix it. We have lots of time here, so we can go slowly and cover things multiple times if we need to. Also, the way that this talk is structured, there's lots of like mini topics across different areas. So if we do run out of time, it's very easy to cut something out. Nobody's losing out on anything, so it's fine to make this interactive. So first, we're going to look at the building blocks that we'll be using. These are going to be kept to a really high level, and we're going to treat them as like a black box. So you won't have to know how these things are actually implemented, just kind of the interface of the inputs and the outputs and how you can use them. Then we're going to try and frame how we'll be looking at things in terms of arms control. And then finally, we're going to go through a few different systems pertaining to nuclear warheads, DNA printers, and then the security of code and how it's being changed by AI, basically. So Let's start by quickly covering a few cryptographic tools that will function as our building blocks. Today, those are going to be commitments, zero-knowledge proofs, multi-party computation, and blockchains. I'll probably say this again when we get to the blockchain stuff. This has nothing to do with cryptocurrencies. I think it has kind of a bad reputation because of that. Please forget about Bitcoin and things like that. We'll cover what it needs to be when we get there. But I promise that there's other things you can use them for. So the very first tool that we're going to look at is called the commitment. And you can think of this as a sealed envelope that you can place data in. And it has two important properties. So the first is that it's once it's sealed, no one besides you can look inside of it and see what's in there. The second part is that it can later be opened, and people can be sure that the data was not modified while it was in the envelope. So it keeps the data secret until it's opened and ensures the data was not modified in the meantime. So those are the two things. You can't look inside of it, it's secret, and then later when it's opened, you can be sure that nobody messed with it. The next tool that we're going to be using are zero-knowledge proofs. There's different versions of this. One thing is called a ZK snark, which you mentioned earlier. We probably won't be using that word a lot, but here it's not exactly true, but zero-knowledge proof and ZK snark, you can kind of swap them back and forth. But they allow you to prove that you have knowledge without revealing the specific contents of that knowledge. So that probably doesn't make sense. That sounds kind of weird. So I'm going to walk you through an example. I think it'll make a lot more sense. So here we have two people, and the person on the left wants to convince the person on the right that they know the answer to this puzzle without actually telling them what the answer is or how to solve the puzzle. So naturally, you can imagine this, that the person said, I know the answer, but it's a secret, I'm not going to tell you. You probably roll your eyes and be like, yeah, sure you do, whatever. But, you can give a zero-knowledge proof. It would just look like blocks of math and things like that, that we're not going to go into how that works. But the important thing is that after you do that, the other person does believe that you know the answer to how to solve the puzzle, and they still don't learn what the answer is or any information at all on how to solve the puzzle. They only learn what you were trying to prove, which was that you know the answer, and any direct consequences from that. So, if I prove to you that I know like 3 plus something is 7, and then you believe me, you can work out that it had to be 4 because it was basic. But for more complicated things, there's not immediate logical deductions that you can make from something like that. So for everything we're going to be looking at, it's basically impossible to move backwards and figure out what they were looking at. The next tool that we're going to look at is called multi-party computation. It's called MPC for short. So if you see like the letters MPC anywhere, that's what that's about. It's going to seem like magic also, just like zero-knowledge proof if you haven't seen it before. But it allows groups of people to run functions together without learning what each other's inputs or outputs into that function are. So here we have some function f, and it takes in 2 inputs, x and y, and it's going to produce 2 outputs, a and b. So the person on the left has x, and the person on the right has y. They do not know each other's x and y. At the end of running this, the person on the left is going to get a, and the person on the right is going to get b. But they don't learn each other's input. So the person on the left never learned what y or b was, and the person on the right does not know what x or a was, but they are sure that they ran the function correctly together and that they got the right things out of it. Now, what we're going to see later is that instead of just like math, you can generalize this to bigger concepts like, is this thing in a database, or is this part of a bigger set or something like that? And finally, the last thing we're going to look at are blockchains. Which again, I want to say, everybody in this room has heard of them. We're going to not talk about cryptocurrency. This has nothing to do with that. But there are 2 properties that they have that we're going to try and keep in mind. I make fun of cryptocurrencies all the time too. So if that's what you're thinking, that's fine.
It's a very specific inside joke.
But there's 2 use cases or properties that they're going to fulfill. And we could think of them as some abstract thing that fulfills these 2 things. So the first is that it's an append-only ledger. So you can add something to it, and then you're going to be sure that it stays there forever. There's no way to go back in the past and modify something without everybody noticing that something has changed on it. So I think people have probably heard of that use of a blockchain before. People want to use it for supply chain things and stuff like that. But the other thing that a lot of people don't think about is that it's a computer that can't be turned off. If you give it a program, it's going to run and carry out the calculation, and nobody's able to stop it from finishing. The word for this is a smart contract that Ethereum and some other things use. But it doesn't have to just be financial things. We're going to see that it's actually going to be used as a way for auditing and accountability and making sure that like warrants are used correctly. So here's a few important principles for arms control that's going to frame the design of these systems. The first is that we're not looking to solve all of these problems. Nuclear weapons, for example, are really complicated, technically, legally, politically, and so on. There's not some magic bullet that's just going to fix everything. What we do want to do, though, is improve the area and add layers of defense to it. We're trying to make things harder for the bad guys or easier for the good guys, and the more that we can stack up on top of each other in this direction is a win. The next thing is that history has shown us that there's value in trust building, small voluntary gestures, hoping to get reciprocation, and building up larger agreements over time have been valuable in the past. So specifically the nuclear stuff is going to rely on that. So our first system that we're going to look at is about tracking nuclear warheads. Warheads are made up of multiple interchangeable parts, and they are not always kept together in an assembled state. They require regular maintenance, and they change locations. Countries are reluctant to let others conduct on-site inspections, and these sites have strict rules where electronics, photos, and videos are not allowed. Warheads are stored in containers, and they can be split up into multiple ones. And so in general, they're kind of hard to track. Our primary goals are to track warheads and slowly reveal information on them to the other country. So this allows both sides to better understand the overall inventories and move towards disarmament. This process needs to be gradual, and given that we don't trust each other and revealing all of your info at once without getting the same in return is too difficult, people are not going to agree to do that. So we have a bunch of restrictions to consider. Some info is just too sensitive, such as the design or composition or the performance or the current location of warheads. And tracking also can't be too intrusive or disrupt any operations. So what do we have to work with? Well, both sides already have databases of their warheads, and both sides also have reasons to believe that the other's is accurate. It's really expensive to keep a real log and then like a second shadow log of what's actually happening. You can imagine that this is a huge problem for, internal threats and terrorism. If you have multiple logs, you're trying to keep them organized while hiding things from the other side, it gets much more complicated. You're more likely to misplace one of them. If you misplace just one nuke, this is a huge problem inside of your country. So it's not like, oh, we got most of them, but a couple went missing. You can't do that. You have to be really careful about all of them. We also have satellites that can see each other's storage and shipment. There's probably also spies in each other's countries that if they notice that, hey, something is moving in and out of the space and their log doesn't match up with that, they're going to report it back to their home country and notice that something's off. So let's start by showing an example of how the system works by showing operation and how it's recorded. We're going to build up to the larger system from there. So here we have this guy who wants to perform a repair on his warhead, like maybe a tritium bottle or a battery needs to be replaced. We're going to keep track of lots of relevant information, such as the time, the location, the operation performed, and so on. In this case, it's going to be January in Texas, but again, these numbers don't matter. You can swap them out with other things. All of this information is placed into a commitment, which was that sealed envelope that we talked about earlier. Again, if somebody does not remember the details of that, just interrupt me and ask, oh, what was the thing with that again? But in addition to putting it inside that envelope, we're also going to write a zero-knowledge proof showing that it's correct. I don't know why it's pi. This is the standard symbol that's used throughout cryptography. Pi does not mean 3.14 and so on. It's like a math proof. But it's showing that it follows all of the rules in the treaty. For example, maybe to perform a repair on the warhead that had to be the previous thing that it did, you had to move it to an inactive state in the previous commitment in order to have a repair on it. If you did not follow the sequence of events, then this is not some type of a valid operation. So you can define lots of rules for what has to happen. And this proof is showing that all of these rules were followed and that you're not lying about anything. The commitment and the zero-knowledge proof is then sent to the other country. And the other country can't read what's inside of the commitment, but they can be sure that whatever is in it won't be changed before it's opened due to the properties of the commitment. And they can also be sure that the contents inside of that envelope follow all of the rules that they agreed to in the treaty because of what a zero-knowledge proof does. Meanwhile, over in Russia, we have this guy who needs to move one of their warheads. In Russia, a lot of this happens via rail. And from this next slide, you're going to see that I almost went into art school, but I decided not to. Here's my animation of it being loaded onto the train. Look at that. But anyway, then when it's transported to a new location, they record all this info and they place it inside of their own commitment and they write their own zero knowledge proof. And then that is sent over to the US. Again, when the US gets this, they don't know what happened. They just know that something happened and that whatever it was followed all the rules that they agreed to inside the treaty. One of these fields in the commitment is actually the previous commitment of the warhead. This is the hash code stuff that you were talking about before. And this ends up causing the same properties of a blockchain where if you modify something in the past, it makes all the future things invalid. So you'd notice that it's wrong. So that's what makes this structure here where you can be sure that people are not going and updating things from the past even after they're revealed. So this linking creates the blockchain-like structure. And we can take the data from these databases and create a unique identifier for each warhead that we've been calling a passport. So since some of this data has already been recorded, this is an example of one of the passports. You can imagine above the red line is a bunch of old historical data before this system was created. All of that, you can make a cutoff point and place it inside of one commitment. And then each row after the red line are the new updates. And you'll notice those long things on the right, those are actually the cryptographic commitments. And if you look at them diagonally, those are the same. And it's because they have a link back to what the old one was. So how does this actually end up building up trust? Well, the two countries take turns asking each other to open up old updates. This might be part of an old entry, such as the time and location, or it might be all of the fields. So you don't have to open up the entire envelope. You can open up just parts of it and say, I'm going to show you what the time was or what the operation was, but not what all of the fields were inside that envelope. Over time, each challenge ends up revealing more data and builds confidence in the overall inventory as you see how the pieces properly connect and interact. The previous openings can also influence future requests. So if you see that an operation was moved from one spot to another, then you know that the next one has to start in that location and you can base your queries off of that going forward. So this creates almost like a game of Battleship where you can take turns and like your new questions do not have to be related to your old ones, but they can and they can inform it over time and you can build this kind of broader picture slowly. So in summary, these commitments act as a way of tracking a warhead throughout its life cycle, and it also allows for the partial sharing of data and proving that entries follow the treaty in order to build confidence. So that's what we worked on together. But now I've been talking to Dan Zukov and Rose Gadamoller and some other people about extending this further and kind of trying to think about nuclear treaties on these warheads more abstractly as just kind of sharing data and information in general. So I'm building a new framework on how to think about nuclear warhead treaties in terms of information sharing, and it breaks down into these stackable layers. I want to examine how much information we're sharing and try and build a framework that lets us look at the topic differently. Obviously, sharing more information lets parties learn more, but there are also risks of sharing too much. So the question kind of is there a way to get the benefits of this while minimizing the downsides? So for starters, almost all the work done on treaties so far, I'm just going to put into this bottom layer. They share much less information than that system I was just telling you about. The cryptographic data exchange system sits in this middle layer. So all the old treaties, this is the bottom layer. Everything I just walked you through for the last like 10 or 15 slides, that's this middle layer. And parties in this middle layer can query information about individual warheads in kind of this constrained way. But can we go further? Can we ask more types of questions with less constraints? Specifically, we need to be careful. I think we can, but we need to introduce something I'm going to call optionality to balance out the cost. We'll explain what that is in a second. But the way that I'm looking at this in this hierarchy is that this is tiers of information sharing. So commonly in the past, this was just sharing fixed data. So at the start of a treaty, countries specify what updates they're going to share with each other, what inspections are going to be allowed, how to bring newly developed weapons into the treaty, and so on. So this is kind of like sharing fixed data. We extended this already to allow for sets of questions to be defined ahead of time instead of just the data. So you're allowed to ask questions from a specified list. What type of action was that? where did the warhead move to, and so on. And now what I'm proposing is that we extend this to any question, specifically very flexible questions on statistics over the entire inventory. Going from, to give you a few examples, going from least intrusive to most intrusive in terms of examples. How many warheads are shipped for dismantlement per month on average? How many transfers of warheads between national and base level storage sites occur per month on average? How many times do limited life cycle components get swapped in a warhead's lifetime on average? So now if you're thinking that there's no way that anybody would ever be willing to answer that last question, that's okay. That's where we're going to introduce this concept of optionality. So I want to examine this space and see if there's anything that we can find here. Along the x-axis is optionality, which is basically your ability to choose to answer or not. As you get on the left, you have to answer no matter what. That's the rule that you agreed to. As you get to the right, you have more and more freedom to say, no, I'm not willing to answer that question. Along the y-axis is generality, or how much information is being shared. So down on the bottom, not very much, old traditional treaties. Going up higher, you get more flexible questions and the aggregate statistics and everything we were just talking about. So I kind of see three broad regions on this graph. So the first is if you have heavy constraints where not much can be learned, the questions are not very useful, but people are free to choose or to participate or not, then nobody wants to use this system because it's not useful. On the other hand, if any of the information can be learned, but everybody has to answer, then this is way too sensitive. I think this is what people maybe try and do when agreements break down and people don't enter treaties, and you can't end up coming to an agreement on anything because it reveals too much. It's not sensitive. It's not safe. But I think that there might be this region in between the two where it's effective. But it's not a point. It's not. In the past we would have just the bottom left part of it where you have to do it, but you don't learn that much. But I think maybe it's actually this 2D space where you can get more generality as long as you balance it out with not having to go along with it. So the goal of this is that in times of good relations, people might be more open to sharing information, and in bad times, they might not want to participate. So it's very hard to lock people into a long agreement where they don't know what the future relations are going to be like. So this is kind of like having the ability to build in future mini negotiations without having to make a new treaty each time. The lower tiers of the stack I was showing you earlier ensure that traditional goals of arms control are met, while the upper tiers let you accelerate trust building when things are going well. I think this is going to be clear by walking you through an example of what this top layer might look like if it was implemented. So here we have two countries, and each has something called a question queue. So at any time, a question or a side can make a statistical question about the other side's inventory. So here's that first thing that we had: how many warheads are shipped for dismantlement per month on average. This gets put into a message and put into the other country's queue. They don't have to answer it right away. And in fact, they don't ever have to answer it if they don't want to. Similarly, the other side is free to ask questions as well. So here they're asking how many transfers of warheads between national and base level storage sites occur per month on average. That just ends up going in the other country's queue. And for our final example, it was how many times do limited life cycle components get swapped in a warhead's lifetime on average. We're going to see the effects of the varying sensitivity of these questions in a moment. But for now, they just go into each other's queues. Some amount of time passes. Maybe they meet every 4 months or something like that. But in the future, they have all these questions built up, and they get together and they decide that they're going to compare these queues and see if there's anything that they agree on. So some of the questions they might look at and find just completely unacceptable. There's no way they're ever going to answer those, so they just throw them out. But others they might look at and say, oh, okay, yeah, actually, I'd be willing to do that. We asked the same question here. If you answer that one, I'll answer it too. And they might even find multiple trades that are not the same. Again, we're trying to build up this general thing. It would be possible to, when this actually gets negotiated, say that they have to be the same question or something like that. But my system is built out where they could be different. So they might say, oh, that, you asked question X over there. That's interesting. I'll be willing to answer it if you ask question Y. And if they both agree to this, then they find some type of a trade to make. So let's look at how one of these trades is actually executed. So once both parties agree on the pair of questions that they're going to answer, they automatically generate a response from the databases to the query, and they write a proof of correctness showing that they're not lying and that everything in the database pertains to this and that it's being answered correctly. And then they kind of automatically swap the two simultaneously so that they get each other's things. And then once they have the answer to their question, they can read the other person's proof and ensure that it was answered correctly, and they have a mathematical guarantee that the other side was not lying about what they're giving. Finally, so then they're verifying it, they see that it's okay, and then they move on. One really interesting consequence of the system that is not immediately obvious is that it actually allows you to prove negative statements. A negative statement is saying that something is not happening. So one useful area for this is in showing that a ban is being followed. So let's say that the US and Russia agree on a ban on deploying nuclear warheads on short, medium range, and intermediate range based missiles in Europe. So broadly, these areas. Hypothetically, we can imagine that this corresponds to bases in these regions. We're going to ignore the details of specific sites, but in reality, you'd specify all the different sites and say it can't be at these locations. It could look like the sides declaring which missile bases they could feasibly deploy INF range ground-based missiles at, and then verifying that they never co-locate nuclear warheads at the storage bunkers and at those bases at the same time. The sides want to transparently prove to each other that they're not co-locating nuclear warheads. This could be a political agreement or a moratorium or a legally binding treaty with a broader verification mechanism. The data exchange process would involve the following. First, we'd specify some type of matching criteria. If rules were broken, what would these entries end up looking like? Well, they'd be during the time that the ban was in effect. They'd also be in the red circled regions on that map, and they would be the type of missile units that we said were being banned. The side would now prove two different things. The first is that the average number of entries across these sites that meet these conditions is 0. They'd also prove that they don't have any negative entries. The reason that we want that is we don't want to have a situation where one side could say that one area has like 5 bad entries, and then some other area in that region, they lie and say it has -5, and this is hidden somewhere in the proof. And when you average these out, it says, oh, there was 0 in this region, and it's fine. If you give a second proof saying that there were no negative things, well, no negative things and an average of 0 means that you have to have 0 across the board. So if you have 0 things that are wrong in that region, well, that means that there were no entries that exist, which also means that the ban was being followed. Also keep in mind that, this was kind of a basic example with just a couple of rules, but this could get as complicated as you want. You could have hundreds of these rules combined in different ways, and you'd still just prove that all these matching criteria were being followed, and then whatever the consequences of that would be. Okay, so that's everything I have for the nuclear warheads. I'm going to move on to DNA printers now. For our next application, we're going to look at DNA printers, and the way that they kind of abstractly work is that you give them a DNA sequence, and then it prints it out and it constructs it. This could be, a drug that helps people or some science project. It could also be viruses and bacteria and all these dangerous things that we're worried about. Traditionally, the way that this works is that you get your sequence and you send it off to a large company. They examine it, confirm that it's safe in some way, and then they print it out, and then they send it back to you. Because of many recent developments in desktop synthesizers, they're becoming way more capable and way cheaper. These machines could be placed in your office or your basement, and they have basically no oversight. Ideally, we'd want these printers to not work if it's a dangerous sequence, just refuse to print out the thing. But legitimate customers want to protect their intellectual property, and they don't want to reveal what they're printing. So we also want to keep a list of dangerous sequences private to avoid publishing kind of like a handbook on how to construct these dangerous weapons as well. So we have this problem where the people that want to print things want to keep whatever they're trying to print private. On the other hand, the government or some other organization wants to keep what you're not allowed to print private as well. So we have to somehow negotiate this where you can prove that you're printing something safely, but not learning what you're not allowed to print, and the government's not allowed to learn what you are printing. So as a first step, instead of stopping DNA printers from doing bad things, what about if we voluntarily prove that the print is safe? Currently, there's a lack of regulations and standards of how to do this. There's also no incentives for companies to do this. So it's really hard to come up with some hypothetical system that you're not sure if it's going to work or not, ask these companies to spend millions of dollars putting into their hardware and rolling everything out, only to find out, oh, there was some flaw, like this entire concept. So instead of stopping bad things from happening, we're starting by proving that good things are happening voluntarily, making sure that works. If that does work, then you have some type of a framework to think about. You can start writing laws. You can test to see if it works. And you can gradually phase this in. And once you feel good about everything, then you can pass laws saying that you have to follow the system. Also, in fields like civil engineering, for example, if you want to build a bridge, you have to have this track record of building things successfully and having certain licenses and stuff like that, or degrees in order to be able to get a license from the state or city or wherever you live in order to be allowed to be a civil engineer there. Bioengineering does not have anything like this right now, but I've been talking to some bioengineering professors talking about how people are starting to talk about this and how they want to do this, but there's no track records for anybody or ways of deciding if people have certain reputations. So this system would also let people build up a good reputation over time that could be used for a licensing requirement as well. So as I mentioned earlier, the threat model here is very different than the nuclear warhead example. Nukes require lots of special equipment to make, and they can be tracked via satellites. But bioweapons can be done by one person with just a biology degree sitting in their basement. We're also concerned with different threats here. For nuclear actors, we're kind of scared of like state actors, whereas for the biology problem, we're scared of non-state actors such as terrorists. You know, a government wouldn't be using a desktop synthesizer. They just have their giant facility using traditional old synthesizers. So here we have someone who wants to print out a specific sequence. That's supposed to be a DNA printer. They want to print out that sequence in the top right. So let's imagine that there's some independent organization responsible for keeping track of dangerous sequences and keeping them private. When a print is requested, we're going to have them engage an MPC with them, which was that thing where you can run a function together and you don't learn what each other are putting into it, and you don't learn what each other are getting out. Also, the reason that that picture has like multiple servers, using cryptography, it's possible to design something where if you hack into any one of them, you don't learn anything. You have to actually hack into all of them, and none of them are individually storing the entire list of bad sequences. They have to work together and do some other cryptography to produce the list together. So the purpose of this is going to be to figure out if the user wants to print is on the list of banned sequences or not. The challenge that I mentioned earlier is that the requested print has to be kept private from the organization in order to protect their intellectual property and their privacy, and the user can't learn about the content of the list of all the banned sequences. So luckily, MPC is going to let us run this kind of abstract function of, is this thing in this list, without either side learning each other's inputs. So the person is putting in that thing on the left where it's the sequence. The organization is putting in the list of banned sequences. They don't learn each other's inputs, so there's nothing wrong there. And they also don't learn each other's outputs. So they're going to learn broadly, like, was this thing safe or not, but they're not going to learn anything else from each other. At the end, the service is going to send back a proof saying whether it was in the list or not. And this proof is going to be something that the user can show to other people to prove to them that whatever they're doing is safe. So I could send something off to the service, get a proof back saying it's safe, and when I show it to all of you, you'll believe that whatever I was trying to print was approved and that it's okay and that it's not in that list of bad things, even though you don't get to see what I'm trying to print. After receiving this proof, the user is going to post it to a blockchain along with the commitment containing the sequence, a description of it, and other relevant information, like metadata about what they were printing, the time and location, and maybe an English description of what it is, what lab they were working at, and things like that. This all goes on to the blockchain so that nothing can be altered from the past. You can be sure that it's on there forever. Certain organizations like the CDC or WHO are going to have special permission to be able to peek inside of those commitments. So they're allowed to go onto the blockchain and look at any of those sealed envelopes and look inside of them and see what's there. But the cool thing that we're going to do is we're going to use that other property of blockchains, which is the computer that you can't stop the code from running. So in the event of an accidental leak or an attack or a credible threat, they would be able to obtain a warrant, and then this lets them open up those things. But when they do a search, the user is automatically notified by that computer that can't be turned off that their thing is being searched. So this is going to stop the CDC or WHO or somebody like that from just going through and searching everybody's thing, because whenever they choose to do a search, it's going to notify the person that they're being searched. So you better actually have a warrant to back that up. Otherwise, you're going to be noticed that you're doing this. So this is supposed to stop groups with special permission from abusing their power and just searching through every single thing on the blockchain. Some investigations also might only depend on certain fields. So I mentioned this earlier, but the envelopes don't have to be opened up all the way. You can just get certain things out of them. So the commitment can open up individual fields without revealing all of them. And this is trying to preserve the principle of revealing the least amount of info possible to the fewest number of people in order to accomplish the job. These two topics, DNA printers and network security, actually share a lot in common. So that thing I just showed you is the first of the two projects I'm working on. It's largely all planned out now, and I have some students building out the code, and that should be done by the end of the summer, probably. But after that, I'm starting this new project that I want to work on. And it really came about by just talking to bioengineering professors and biology students. And what we noticed is that the problems that people working on DNA printers in biology have been struggling with actually have tons in common with just old things from computer security and computer networking from like even going back to like the 80s. And the problem was that biology people didn't know that people have already been working on these problems for decades, just with different words. And the computer science people had no idea that the biology people were even having these problems. So our goal is to build some type of like common lexicon or map between the languages that will let them actually work together going forward. So we're going to start off with trying to build this thing called like a kill chain. And what a kill chain is that in order to successfully launch an attack, the attacker has to successfully navigate every single step. And if any of them fails, then the entire attack fails. So the goal of this project at the end is going to be to have this map between the language and then this sequence of steps that a terrorist would have to go through in order to successfully launch their attack. And we're not actually trying to solve those problems. We're just trying to identify what the problems are and give people the language to work together. And then at the end, we're hoping to start our own conference and put out a paper that's like the map between these things. And then say, we don't have the answers to these 7 problems or whatever, but here's what they are. And here's how computer scientists and biology people can work together. And then people submit papers to our conference, each one focused on a different one of the problem. And then hopefully collectively, the two fields can get together and solve the problem. This is still very much a work in progress, and it's in its infancy. And what I'm showing you is really just a rough draft of what this kill chain is going to look like. I'm actually looking for people to collaborate with on this project. So if anybody has a biology background and wants to help me with this, I would love to have help on that. So please come and talk to me later if that's you. But the first step on this thing is the first step of the kill chain, and I'm trying to describe these problems with the DNA printers, also how they relate to the computer science and security terms. So the first step is that you'd have to actually obtain the sequence that you want to print. So a large component of computer security focuses on making sure that only approved people are allowed to access certain data. This extends to how can we identify if people already have obtained a sequence. In addition, there's new things with AI where they're discovering and synthesizing new novel sequences from scratch that we don't already have in a database, which complicates this. So there's a lot of overlap between multiple sections of computer science here with the biology problem. And we want to see if the really long history of data control access across the literature has a role to play in identifying ways that we can tell if people have obtained these sequences and what they're doing with them. The second step is going to be sharing and storing these sequences, which might actually have like the strongest connection to computer security and cryptography here. There's been a lot of work in cryptography, specifically the last few years, on preventing the spread of CSAM material, which is child sexual abuse material. In general, we want to have people keep their privacy. People want end-to-end encryption, which is, if you and I are talking, we have the key, but nobody else has the key, so they can't tell what we're saying. There's been pushback from Congress and other groups where they're like, oh, maybe we can't trust you to not do bad things. We should also have a copy of the key so we can see what's going on. Naturally, lots of cryptographers got very worried about maybe this going in that direction legally and politically. So there's been lots of work on how can we still not let anybody else have the key, And we have privacy except for a couple of messages. And if we send certain things, that breaks the encryption and it gets revealed. So maybe the government has a list of known like child pornography images or something like that. And the encryption just doesn't work on encrypting those things, but it works on all other messages. So I can talk about anything, even, like planning some attack or something like that. That is not in that database of the images. So that's all encrypted. Nobody can see that. But if I send you one of those images, that gets revealed and gets reported. Well, there's a direct mapping here where instead of those images, you just have the DNA sequences. So, I can talk to you privately, but if I send you the sequence for what smallpox is, that can be decrypted by other people and they'll notice that we're doing that. It's not just communicating though. This also involves storage, like Google Drive and Dropbox and these other places. They're very worried about what people might be storing on them. But this actually is not different at all to messaging, because when you store something, you can think of that as just sending a message from your current self to yourself in the future. So storing things is actually exactly the same as messaging. And companies like Google want to make sure that you're not doing that on Google Drive. And lots of cryptographers have been working on this problem, but it almost just directly maps onto the stuff from bioengineering. The third step is screening the DNA sequences. So how can I know, or at least have an idea of if something is dangerous or not by looking at the sequence? This feels like it relates to malware scanning. So I don't know if anybody here has done this, but you download some piece of software off of some sketchy website and your computer pops up saying like, oh, this looks dangerous, don't run this, we're not sure what this is. Well, your computer didn't actually run that code and see that something bad happened. Just the metadata around it and like the signature and the way that the code kind of looked gave it some indication this might be a virus or malware or something like that. So maybe some of these techniques can also be used on the DNA sequences. Specifically, maybe we can, train AI models to look at certain sequences and give some type of percentage chance that it's going to end up being dangerous. But maybe going one step further, that won't be enough. And one major problem here is that DNA actually has a lot of redundancy. There's multiple different sequences that will end up being the same protein. And the protein is, actually the dangerous thing that can cause harm. So instead of just screening the DNA sequences, we might actually have to screen the protein themselves. And this is hard, the protein folding and all this stuff is a notoriously difficult problem. But instead of just looking at that, we might have to look at the protein as well instead of just the sequences. So that's why that's the fourth step here. This has a lot of commonalities to malware scanning as well, but could be more analogous to running parts of the code on the computer and seeing if it's the outcome. The internet works by sending little tiny packets of information. And they used to be pretty simple. As they went over the wire, you could just look at them coming and see what was in them. Over time, you ended up having like packets inside of packets to handle different complex scenarios. The insides are sometimes encrypted in different ways. And like inspecting these packets became way more complicated over time. And now there's a lot of work on things called like deep packet inspection, which is looking at this. And this seems kind of similar to, instead of just looking at the sequences of DNA, looking at what they become and different parts of them and how they combine, and doing like some type of deeper scanning on them. So maybe some of these techniques can overlap as well. Then this fifth part might actually be the most important part, but unfortunately, I think it's also going to be the hardest part to get right. We need to stop the physical printer from actually printing a sequence if we decide that it's dangerous. This is a lot trickier than just telling the code to refuse to print if it doesn't have permission. And that's because humans are really bad at security. We just never figure that out. And we're really, really bad at hardware security. And I give you a few examples. Every single Xbox and PlayStation and iPhone that has ever come out has been hacked and jailbroken. These are companies worth many billions of dollars, some of them worth over $1 trillion. They have lots of resources going into preventing this from happening. The hackers have always won every single time. And it's way easier to be the attacker than to defend something. If you want to defend, you have to get every single thing right. You can't make any mistakes. Whereas if you're the attacker, you just need to find one mistake somewhere, you can exploit it. The other problem, why are hackers doing this to the Xbox and the iPhone? Well, it's because they want to steal video games, or they want to watch pirated movies, or they want to if you go back in time far enough, people are doing it to add copy and paste to the iPhone, change how their phone is working. They also do it just because it's fun. So that's what their motivation is. But now imagine like the motivation that a terrorist would have and the resources that they'd be willing to put into it. You know, there's maybe less of them, but I'm willing to bet that they'd work a whole lot harder than like teenagers trying to copy and paste to their iPhone. So there might not be any good things here, but we have to keep looking at this. It's just a really, really hard problem to solve, but it's not entirely hopeless. Anybody can go and buy an iPhone or a PS5 or whatever, but maybe in this world, you know, you'll end up needing licenses to buy these printers, or you'll always have to be online, or you're going to have to submit to frequent physical inspections of somebody coming and looking at your printer and the history of the things that it's printed and what you're doing with it. Also, you know, we're not trying to perfectly solve it. This is just another layer of defense of making it harder. If we can do that, then that's a win. The sixth step is going to be screening the result. So this one's not entirely relevant for at-home desktop DNA printers, but it still has some value. So unfortunately, even when you send it off to a sequence or to some big company to be printed, a good chunk of the companies don't actually screen the resulting product. I don't have the number with me, but I think it's like 20% of them just don't do any screening and just blindly print it out and send it back to you. We need to make sure that they're not doing this. Also, the reason that this is not applicable to the printer that you have at home is if you've already printed it, then you already have it. Nobody's going to take it away from you or tell you that you can't have it after you've printed it. Although maybe there's still something that you can do there where the printer sees that whatever it printed is dangerous and it can make a report that you can't stop and notify people. So you might already have it, but there might be time to stop you from cultivating it further or like weaponizing it or something like that. This is where the malware scanning is really like running the code to see what happens. You know, you could imagine setting up some type of a sandbox and running the code in there and seeing what it does. This is the same as actually synthesizing the DNA sequence and then doing tests on it afterwards and seeing how it behaves and if it's dangerous. If it's a remote place doing the printing, we also need to make sure that their security is totally airtight. We don't want, you know, you submitting a sequence, they screen it, they say it's not dangerous, they haven't acted on it yet. You hack into their server, you change the results saying, oh no, this thing was fine, and then they end up shipping it to you. You need to prevent scenarios like that happening. And that just really, really just relates to classical computer security and the security of servers and other things like that. Sorry, the PowerPoint broke. The seventh step is showing the public that the sequence is safe and making sure that all the relevant metadata for provenance and attribution is attached to it. So this directly relates to all the previous ideas that I showed you about posting permanent records to the blockchain along with relevant data. Things inevitably will go wrong. We're not going to be able to stop everything from happening. Mistakes are going to happen. But when they do, we want to know exactly how it happened and attribute blame to the appropriate parties and then make changes going forward to make sure that these previous mistakes don't keep happening in the future. There's been lots of work in cryptography of, you know, anonymous messaging and being able to track the provenance of messages even though you don't know who they came from. If they all get reported by enough people, it gets revealed who the original person was from the message and the path that it took for like spreading misinformation or something like that. So for example, the system I previously showed you, or systems that trace the origination of forwarded messages even after they're encrypted to help spread the misinformation. That all seems directly related to the provenance and tracking. There's also been some work on like AI models looking at sequences and trying to learn like which lab they came from and if there's indicators of who is doing the research, which is why we want to put that metadata inside those envelopes that are going on the blockchain so we have more evidence for certain AI models to be able to look at things. Switching gears though, now I want to talk about AI. And this is the last section that I have detailed slides on. Although I do have some other projects going on that we can talk about in the Q&A afterwards. I have a new project looking at AI agents being able to hack into things on their own and autonomously operate and how this might relate to cyber warfare and some other things. So at the end, we can talk about that. But for starters, I just want to talk about how AI is changing how we program. And if you're thinking like, oh, I thought this talk was on national security and arms control, why are you talking about like how programmers are choosing to write code? Give me a couple of minutes and I think it'll make sense. So code is everywhere now. And if we don't make sure that it's secure, we're going to have major problems. The security of large corporations affects our economy and many other aspects of our lives. It'd be a disaster if the login page of Amazon or your bank wasn't secure. And with how connected the world is now, it might actually affect you more personally than you realize. Not only do our IoT devices, which is Internet of Things, like your smart thermostat and things like that, they know way more about us than you might realize. And some of them, like security cameras, actually have cameras watching you all day long in your home. They're also the entry point into your network, though. You know, your computer might have a lot of security and it's hard to get into. If I can get into your thermostat, your computer trusts your thermostat, now I can get to your computer from there. So it spreads out, it's very dangerous. Also, critical infrastructure is being run off of code now too. Hospitals have been held ransom by hackers, which has resulted in like people actually dying. It also gets worse from there. Our electrical grid is entirely connected to the internet now. And does anybody remember the Colonial Pipeline attack from a few years ago? So like even like oil pipelines end up, you know, causing tons of economic damage and people dying, and it's because of insecure code. So I hope everybody understands how important it is that the code that we're running is actually secure. But the security of the code is actually a direct product of, you know, the software engineers writing it. So I wanted to understand the consequences of some of the large shifts that are happening in the way that we're choosing to program, because a lot has changed over the past couple of years. Specifically, people are using AI to help them write code. And this has had a huge impact on a lot of things. So let's start with how these AI tools are actually being used. Copilot was announced in 2021, and this is one of several AI assistants that essentially try and predict what will come next. This might be English describing what a piece of code should do, or it might be a previous section of code that it's trying to finish and continue on. They're integrated into the code editors that programmers use, and they act basically like an autocompleter, but it's supposed to be like a more smart, intelligent autocomplete. This particular model was developed by OpenAI, and it's fairly old at this point, which, you know, 3 years ago. Things have changed so much, it's now kind of old and obsolete. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I wanted to see if I can get it to play. Oh, no. Well, this video shows the thing being used, and basically the person you know, types some English of like what they want the code to be doing, and then the AI just writes all the code that's on the screen there, and you don't actually have to do it yourself, which also means that you don't have to understand how it works in order to run it. So when this came out, Google conducted a study where they found that there was a 6% reduction in coding iteration time across 10,000 developers. So people were excited about it for productivity reasons. It's advertised as a way to help people learn how to code and how to work in new languages that you don't know super well. And it actually is pretty impressive. It can solve a lot of kinds of problems that programmers struggle with. This part of the talk was originally a talk I gave at a computer security conference, and I made a joke here about how everybody wanted to use it because the interview questions for software engineering jobs are really hard, and this thing can actually solve those problems better than a lot of us can, and the entire audience started laughing because they knew that it was true. So what I'm trying to get at here is that, at least at the time and still, it was really exciting, it was new, and it was actually impressive of what it could do. And you know, we were talking about this a couple hours ago. It's so much better now than it was a couple of years ago. So needless to say, it started to become really popular and people wanted to use it. And so after Copilot was released, there was a paper called Asleep at the Keyboard, Assessing the Security of GitHub Copilot's Code Contributions. And the authors found that the AI, just totally on its own, ended up writing insecure code. But I wanted to stop here and give some context. Like, what does it mean if code is insecure? I don't think most people understand this. So there's two things. There's correct and there's secure, and they're not the same thing. So correct means that the code correctly solves the problem. In other words, it gives you the right answer. So an example would be if I wrote like a calculator and it's supposed to add numbers. If I give it 5 plus 7, it should return 12. That's what makes the code correct. But secure means that it can't be maliciously taken advantage of. So just because something does something correctly doesn't mean that it doesn't do something unintended when given strange inputs. So these things might let an attacker steal information or gain unauthorized access or even take control of your computer. For the calculator example, it'd be like if I said 5 plus 7 equals, and then it doesn't know what to do with that second plus sign, and then it lets me take control of the computer and do whatever I want with it. That seems kind of extreme, but actually we'll see an example of code later where there was not room to add a minus sign to something, so it actually was just one extra character in one spot, and it ends up causing lots of security problems. Actually, just not having enough room for a couple of characters is actually the source of like the most terrifying bugs across the internet. So this input is unexpected. When you give it nice inputs, the system behaves correctly, but when you give it malicious, strange inputs, the system behaves unexpectedly, and sometimes that can be exploited. So the paper finding that, it wrote insecure code on its own, that's scary. But people don't actually just have the AI write code by itself. People work back and forth with the AI. Also, like the way that you decide to talk to the AI heavily influences what it's going to write. So I wasn't sure how much to trust that study. Well, I mean, it was really interesting, but I didn't know how much it applied to the real world. So I wanted to test this with like real world people using real world problems and see what it did. If it produces insecure results in the real world and people trust the results, then this is really, really bad. Especially if this code is used in production, which means it's being used by actual large companies in practice, things that actually matter. This could also mean that it ends up in an open source library that the company relies on. So I've had some conversations with some of these large tech companies where like, oh, no, we have all these standards and processes. Like when an engineer writes code, their manager has to look at it and approve it and make sure that it's okay. So even if our like lower level engineers are using this AI and they make one of these mistakes, like somebody higher up will catch it and they won't let it go through. In programming though, there's these things called libraries, which are other people's code that are commonly used that you don't have to write yourself, and you import it into your project. And open source code is like something that other people on the internet wrote. It's publicly available for everybody. People import this stuff all the time. And there's some famous examples where giant tech companies that everybody's heard of, that I will not name here, have imported just these tiny little libraries that just manipulate strings of words and like reorder them. And it's like the most basic thing ever. It's like 10 lines of code, but they imported it. And there's one guy developing it and he made a mistake and pushed out an update. And it was a day where like, I don't remember which companies, but like, like Facebook and Google and Amazon, everything like went down for like an entire day. And it was because they were using somebody else's code that had one little tiny bug in it. So I brought this up with some of these companies and then they're like, oh yeah, actually, that's a good point. If one of those people decided to use the AI tools and then we imported it and it got into our system that way, yeah, that would probably cause problems. So we need to understand how real people actually interact with AI assistants, and the way that humans decide to talk to and interact with these systems drastically changes the security of the output. They're also growing in popularity, and AI assistants lower the barrier for programming. We were talking about that. Lots of people that are not classically trained computer scientists can now code and use these for lots of different things. So it lowers the barrier to enter, and it also just might be the new way that people are learning how to program going forward. Lots of people are getting like CS degrees right now, or like teenagers teaching themselves are using these tools all the time, and like they don't know what it's like to program without these things anymore. People were concerned about how they were being used and the security vulnerabilities that might be happening. And at the time, there were not any extensive user studies on how developers actually interacted with these AI assistants. So our goal was to conduct this user study, which is kind of like the first one looking at this in order to fully understand the problem. And so what we wanted to know is, do programmers write more insecure code with AI assistants? Additionally, do people trust the AI assistants? So we did this by splitting people up into two groups. One where the people had the AI assistant and the other did not. You can think of this as like a randomized control trial. We're doing this to try and control for any outside factors like programming experience or security backgrounds. And we asked them 5 questions across 5 different areas that spanned 3 different programming languages. So this all started with recruiting participants. So we ended up with 47 qualified participants consisting of undergrads, graduate students, and engineers from 4 large companies. For the students, this ranged from people that were early in college, like freshmen and sophomores, all the way up to like senior, 5th-year PhD students that should be very, very experienced in not making some of these mistakes. We then randomly split them into an experiment group that had access to the AI assistant and a control group that did not, but both had full access to the internet. We had 33 participants in the experiment group and 14 in the control group. The reason for this roughly 2/3, 1/3 split was to be able to collect more data on participants interacting with AI to have more qualitative things for analysis. All of the statistical tests that we did are valid for unequal samples, so that was fine. We gave each potential participant a pre-screening question to ensure that they had adequate programming experience, and then we gave them a tutorial on how to use the AI assistant and answer questions in the study. Finally, people were given 5 programming tasks covering a range of security problems across several different programming languages. We found that on almost every question, people who had access to the AI assistant did worse. And not only did they do worse, but they did substantially worse. So if you look at this table, the percentages on the right in red are way, way smaller than the ones on the left. This is like the percentage of people that got things correctly and wrote secure code. So this seems kind of crazy. This is way more extreme than I thought it was going to be. So we're going to dig in a little bit deeper and look at some broader themes of how this happened. We're going to learn what the AI did and how people interacted with it in order to get these results. So I've taken some of the mistakes that we found and classified them into 3 broad buckets. Each is going to teach us something about how the AI assistant behaves and what we need to watch out for while using it. So let's look at the buckets. The first is that the AI assistant regularly misuses libraries. And this includes not authenticating their encryption, using unsafe cipher modes, and not using a library or choosing libraries with insecure randomness. I'm going to assume that most people don't have like strong programming backgrounds here. If you do, let me know and I can go faster. But I'm going to stop here and try and explain what these different words mean, because I think otherwise it's going to be very confusing. So libraries are the things I was talking about before, where it's other people's code that you're using. Some things are really hard, like specifically cryptography code is like known to be like the hardest code to write. Almost nobody can. They don't have the mathematical background to write it correctly. Also, like just because it produces the right thing for encryption does not mean that it's okay. Any type of message you put in has to take exactly the same amount of time to be done because otherwise, you can look at how long things take and deduce what it was and like get the key and all these other things. There's just so many things that can go wrong in this that like normal programmers are not capable of writing this code. So they have to import it and use other people's stuff. For encryption, okay, great. Authenticating encryption is what lets you make sure that things are not changed. So, I can send you a message and it can be encrypted and nobody can read it. But if it's not authenticated, it means that somebody else can change it and you'll get a different message and I won't know that it was changed. Unsafe cipher modes or not using a library would let people just read what your thing does. And insecure randomness ends up being a huge problem with signing messages where people can forge other people's signatures and make it look like you said something that you didn't, which could be, approving like a bank transaction or something like that. So let's take a step back. When choosing a library, a lot of things can go wrong. Crypto libraries have historically had misusage problems and unsafe defaults. There's also a lot of supply chain problems. You're importing these libraries that you don't understand. The people that wrote those libraries are importing other libraries that they might not understand. It makes this giant tree of you don't know where software is coming from anymore. So many things can go wrong here. So you might wonder, like, does the AI understand all of this? Does it know which libraries are okay to use? If a library has some things that are okay and some things that are not okay, does it know which parts of it are fine to use and which parts to stay away from? The answer to that is no, it does not. It doesn't understand which libraries are okay or which parts of the safe libraries are okay to use. The AI assistant is basically just predicting what comes next. And it learned all of this just off of public code that was on the internet. And a lot of the public code that's on the internet is wrong and it's insecure. Or it maybe even used to be secure. And then we've learned that now it's not. It's still there, though. Or there's actually code where people write something and then write, this is not secure. This is why. And it's like an educational thing. People have examples showing you what not to do. And the AI reads all of that and it's like, oh, yes, I can copy that. I can do that. So this graph shows for the encryption problems, the blue is the experiment group that had the AI. The yellowish green color is the people that did not have the AI. More is worse. Auth is authentication, like your message being changed. Trivial is just using some bad encryption scheme where people can read what you're writing and it's not actually secret. So I guess because of time, I'm going to speed up a little bit and not go into some of the details, but more is worse. The blue bar being a lot higher, they made way more mistakes. I'll show you, I don't expect you to understand all the code, but I'll show you how this type of thing can happen. So this is an answer that was written almost entirely by an AI, that somebody worked with it. This is what the AI wrote. They went through it, they're like, oh yes, this looks good, I would use this. This is not authenticated properly. And to show you what's wrong with this code, because it's like 95% right. It's like almost entirely right. The only parts that are wrong are those two parts. The rest of it's all perfect. Ciphertext is the thing that you've encrypted, like your message, and tag is the thing that makes sure that it has not been changed. And the AI just returns the ciphertext, but not the tag. And then later when it's decrypting it, it doesn't check to see that the tag is right. But the rest of it's all correct. And at the top part, if it said return ciphertext, comma, tag, comma, cipher dot nonce, then that would be right. And on the bottom part, if it just had one more line saying like verify tag, then it would be right. Those are like the only things missing from this answer. It's really, really close, but people trust the AI and they just moved on with it. Another one would be signing messages. So this problem presents itself even earlier in the coding process during the library selection. Signing things is hard. Most participants ended up signing their messages correctly. It's a correct signature. It does everything it's supposed to do. But they used a library that had unsafe randomness. You have to be very careful with where your random numbers are coming from. So the problem here is that if you actually go and read the documentation for how this library works that they chose to use, the whole top section in English, not code, it says this library is not secure. This was made for educational purposes. If you actually need to use this for a real thing, use this other library instead, and they link off to the right thing that you should be doing, and then they give examples of how you should do it. The problem, and I guess I won't look too much at the slides here, but if you're using the AI assistant, you don't ever have to go to this page and read how it works. The AI just writes it for you, you run the code, it works like you think it should, so then you move on. And you never even see any of the warnings here. But if you have to go and look at it yourself, and you're trying to figure out how it works and looking for examples of how to use it and all the documentation for it, you're going to see all these giant warnings at the top telling you that you're not supposed to be using this. So when you end up looking at it, there's tons of mistakes here. This one, how much time do we have left?
I think another 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. I'm gonna,
Q&A.
This one, we won't go too much into the code because I think this one is pretty hard to understand if you're not a programmer. But this was basically asking people to make a folder on the computer where people are allowed to do whatever they want inside the folder, but they're not allowed to leave the folder. So that's like a sandbox, basically, where things are safe in this area. It's kind of like a jail and everything's kept inside of it. In order to solve this problem, you have to know a lot about how the file system works and all these other things about a computer. So how did programmers end up learning all that stuff? Well, they took a bunch of classes on it. They also have to use it in their day-to-day life every single day, and they're constantly interacting with it and seeing all the consequences. But that's not how the AI assistants learned how these things worked. They never learned what a file system is or how they work. They just saw lots of examples of how you interface with one. But if you don't actually know how it works and you just know kind of this abstract interface, then you're bound to make mistakes. So here's two different types of security mistakes. And you can see again, the experiment group made way more mistakes. The part of this code, again, it's basically just this one line. If that said canonicalize instead of norm path, then the answer would be correct and everything would be fine. I'll skip over this. This is a thing showing how the attack works. But the really interesting thing here, I don't know if the videos are going to play since we had problems with the old one. No, they're not. But these showed people asking the AI the question. And if you say, if you just give it that problem, it writes an answer on the left and it's not secured, it has all these problems. But if you give it the same thing and you say, do it securely and make sure you canonicalize the path, the AI writes the answer perfectly and there's no problems. So it's capable of writing all this stuff securely and correctly. The problem, though, is that specifically that word canonicalize is not something that most people know about. If you don't know to use that word in your prompt, the AI does not write a secure answer. But the only people that would ever use that word are people that already know how to solve it securely. So this is a huge problem. But what I'm trying to get at there is that the AI is like incredibly sensitive to initial conditions and tiny little word changes that you give it. Changing one word in the prompt means, completely insecure, one of the worst types of attacks that you can have, versus everything's completely fine and there's no problems. And it's just like one word that's different. The same thing happens with databases. I won't go through all the code here, but you can see how big the difference was here. It's like 37% versus like 6% for mistakes. People that did it on their own, almost everybody did it perfectly. It was fine. People that use the AI assistant, like over a third of them, just completely insecure. This is the type of attack that lets people steal your password and information. Like whenever you see that like all of your medical records were taken or like your social security number was taken from somewhere, it's always like this type of attack. And here you can see people that use the AI a third of the time make that mistake. So we should all feel good about that. And again, like the mistake is just that one part of the code. The rest of it's right. Then the final thing is this language called C, which is notoriously very hard. This question was asking people to take a number and turn it into the words for the number. So, it has commas in it and things like that. The AI assistant actually had a lot of trouble with this. I couldn't make the answer. So people instead tried to split up the problem and have it do it in little pieces. And they ran into edge cases where they couldn't combine things correctly. So I'm not going to go over this, but the way that numbers are stored on computers is not what you might think. Actually, there is that's the biggest number and the smallest number that's on a computer. And when you look at them, you see they're not actually the same. That ends with a 7 and that one ends with an 8. There's one more negative number than positive numbers. So going back to these mistakes, the first two, it's not actually very clear. But if you look at that third one, that third type of mistake, 0 people without the AI made that mistake. But like a fifth of people that use the AI all made this mistake. And the reason that that happened is when you're trying to take the number and turn it into that string, people ended up saying like, if the number is positive, do all this stuff, make it the word version of the number. And if it's negative, just do the stuff for the positive thing, and we're just going to stick like a dash in front of it for the minus sign, which sounds like totally reasonable. And it works for every single number on the computer except for one of them. It doesn't work for that smallest one, because when you take that smallest number and you multiply it by -1, that is now 1 bigger than the biggest number on the computer. And the way that this actually works is if you go too low, it loops around to the big ones. And if you go too high, it loops around to the small ones. So if you take the smallest number, multiply it by -1, that is 1 bigger than the biggest, which is actually the smallest one again. So, so now when you're doing this, you have some type of buffer that holds these characters for the string. And let's say it's like 10 letters long. But because you now have the negative sign that you're trying to put in the front, that ends up being 11 letters long. This is exactly what we were talking about the calculator before, where there's that extra plus sign. And it can't handle this, and it causes a horrible mistake. We did some surveys where we asked people, like, did you like the AI assistant? Would you like to keep doing this? Did you trust it? And we found the middle two are the most extreme examples where people loved it. They thought it did a great job. The people that used the AI assistant had way more security mistakes, but they all believed that they did even better than the other people. They all trusted it. They said that they wanted to use it. There were engineers from giant software companies that were like, yes, I would use this every single day. This is great. When does this become public? Can I use this? I have a few quotes from people. We're out of time, but the broad themes would be that instead of looking things up and trying to use it, people just blindly use this and don't think about it too much. They trust it a lot. There's this website called Stack Overflow, which programmers go and ask questions and other programmers go and answer it. And this person said, I hope this gets deployed. It's like Stack Overflow, but better because it never tells you that your questions are dumb. So people really, really like this. And the scary thing here is that they're replacing search and these other traditional things that they're not perfect, but at least we kind of understand how they work. And they're doing this instead. And instead of having to write code, it's shifting the burden onto testing code instead. And this is something that like notoriously programmers are really bad at. People are bad at testing things. They're bad at making sure that things work correctly. And it's also not something that you're taught in college. Like most colleges will teach you how to write code, but nobody ever talks about how to like write proper tests that work and cover all these different things. So we're shifting the burden of responsibility from writing to testing, which is a skill set that just less people have. But yeah, we found that people that had access to AI assistants wrote less secure code, but they also believed that they wrote more secure code. Kind of the worst of all the worlds. So, you know, we look at this picture and we're like, are we here right now? No, I don't think that it's this bad, but it is the direction that we're moving in if we're not careful. And we were talking about this a couple hours ago, a bunch of college students and other people learning how to program only with this thing. They're not learning how to do it alone. So maybe the AI will keep getting better and it'll stop making these mistakes and then we don't have to worry. Or maybe we have a whole generation of people that are going to be writing all the software for our banks and stuff like that that don't actually know how to do it anymore. So that's kind of concerning. There's a bunch of things we can do. You know, we can refine user prompts. We saw that, you know, using that one word ended up drastically changing the security. So maybe we can teach people how to write better prompts, or we can write other systems that will automatically refine your prompt and give a better one to the AI. Those cryptography libraries, there's just so many ways that you can shoot yourself in the foot and screw up. Maybe we can just design them differently so there's less room for error. If there's less room for error, you'd assume that the AI just doesn't have as many options to make those mistakes in the first place. We can teach people how to talk to the AIs to write better code. We can teach people how to write better tests to make sure that things are working. We can also integrate some type of warning into like the code editors. And that might even mean training another AI assistant that doesn't know how to write code, but it can recognize if things are secure or not. So one AI writes the code and the other one looks at it and says, yes or no, and gives you some type of a warning if it's not going well. Later, maybe after recordings, we should talk about this since it's not super public yet. But I'm working on another project where we're basically teaching AIs how to hack into things by themselves. I know it sounds like a bad idea, but anybody can be doing this right now. We don't understand their capabilities and the risk involved, and we're trying to like build a thing where we can measure the current state of risk and how skillful they are, and then give recommendations to like policymakers of where this is going. And this affects like security across the internet, how engineers test their own security, the directions that we want to take AI development in. You know, people don't write secure code. It's hard. There are mistakes all over the internet. One thing helping a lot of people is that hacking is really hard and it takes a lot of work. So, you know, if I'm going to spend a bunch of time trying to hack into something, I'm going to pick a hospital that I can get a lot of money at and not some local like donut store where they just don't have that much money. But you can imagine a world where this can be scaled automatically and done, you know, en masse across the internet without you having to do anything. And now all these little stores all throughout the country all end up with security problems and being hacked and you can't stop them. Also, you know, you might think this applies to everybody around the world equally, but that's not true. You could write a program that goes to each website, and then there's an if statement, and it says, if I'm in the US, then I launch the attack. If my IP address is in Russia, then I don't. And then you just go across the internet, and you do that over and over and over again. And you have this problem, you know, in one country, but not other ones. So this is all very scary. But there's good things too. A big part of building defenses is trying to hack yourself and seeing what works and what doesn't work and then repair it from there. So if you can take these things and run it against your own stuff, that helps. It's a double-edged sword, but the scary parts of that double-edged sword are really, really scary and we don't really know what to do about it yet. But that's all I have to really talk about. My website is there. That QR code links to my LinkedIn. Happy to be friends with anybody that wants to be friends with me. But yeah, thank you all for having me.
Thank you very much. So there was a lot of information there. It was really, really interesting in many different topics. If I can just ask a question or maybe
you can ask as many questions as you want.
Comment, I guess. I'm really excited about multiple agents, as I've been telling you. So the way I would see this problem is that you would just, again, as you know, with the recent announcement from Microsoft, that would be this copilot sitting in you, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, can be trained badly, right? And can suggest insecure code when you actually have written secure code, which is another problem. But the answer is I really do think is multiple agents one sitting on top of the other and constantly teaching in situ, teaching if you have a local LLM that's, as we're saying, like a teachable agent, constantly gets good information about what is the proper way to do things and things like that. So I imagine this will be solved in time.
Maybe. I hope so.
Another question, if I may. What is your feeling? I guess you have multiple things about open source versus closed source, because you mentioned the example where an open source library was not secure, whereas we always think of the advantage of open source is that a lot of people have looked at it.
Yeah, so I guess I have maybe different answers for the LLMs versus everything else. For everything else, I think open source is always better. Like for cryptography and stuff like that, keeping your algorithm secret every single time has been a horrible disaster. The only reason that we have modern things that work is the idea that everything is public except for the key. This is like a very, very important principle in cryptography. I think open source is great and that all of this should be public. That's good. What's not good about it, though, is the supply chain tracking problems. People import other people's code blindly without thinking about it. It is public.
Guilty.
If you were a giant, but if you're writing some academic paper, who cares? It doesn't affect anybody. If you're Facebook, you should have a team of people read through all the code that you're importing. And when a new version of it comes out, you shouldn't just blindly accept it. You should make sure that it's okay. I know that takes a lot of resources and money and stuff like that, so it's complicated. But especially when you know that library is importing other libraries, and somebody could, and this has happened, maliciously, you write a little tiny library that gets used by all these other libraries, and it's good, and then you just wait. And you pretend to be a good person for 3 years, and then you change it to a bad thing, and now you've poisoned everything that follows from it. You have to be very careful about that. But the alternative is not really an option. The modern internet would not function if people did not share code. For AI stuff, though, that might be a little different. I go back and forth on this, and I'm torn. On one hand, you have super intelligence problems, and if it can hack and things like that, maybe you don't want those capabilities all being public and out there. On the other hand, it doesn't feel good to know that only 2 or 3 companies on the planet have the resources to do it, and they get to choose what biases are going to be in it and deploy it and spread whatever their worldview is, and that there's no alternatives to it. I don't think I have an opinion on open versus closed being better for the LLMs.
I think I'm there too.
There's pros and cons for both of them, and they're different, and I go back and forth and I'm torn on it. But in terms of not LLM stuff, I think that everything being open and readable is good.
So let's have some questions. Tanita, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I have a question about the arms control kind of AI diplomacy model. I'm curious, maybe I just didn't understand, but how do you know that the humans inputting the information in aren't lying? What is, you said something really interesting, mathematically verified honesty or something?
Yeah. So this has been a huge problem with not just this system, but computer science in general, maybe, where, I can mathematically prove to you that the entries in that database follow all these things, and here's all the consequences from it. But linking that database to the real world, that's where everything breaks down. And I've been looking at some other things where I want countries to be able to prove that they're not lying, and that certain operations and chain of command and orders for militaries and stuff like that are all fine, but there's not a good link between that and the real world, so I haven't gone forward with it. I'm still thinking about it. But for the nuclear warheads, maybe you want to weigh on this too, but we actually do have better assurances that those databases are accurate, and it's because of what I was talking about before, where there's satellites looking at things, there's spies looking at things. You just have mess up one time, and it gets reported, and now the country doesn't trust anything that's in that other database. Also, the more changes you make, the more complicated it gets to maintain. You misplace one of them, and now you have this potential nuclear threat within your own borders.
So the testing that
And you have on-site inspections and all these
Yeah,
other
but
things from traditional treaties.
Also, like, for example, if in the database is the time to go from one location to another location.
Yeah.
Remember, I think I made a lot of mistakes in my example.
Yes, I remember that.
And so what you could do is you could test to see if it's going from one base to another base, there's a certain amount of time in between, that would be reasonable. And so with this system, you can check to see whether that time is appropriate, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
With the Snark tool.
You have to lie consistently and perfectly over and over again, and it gets more and more complicated to make a cohesive lie that goes together. If you lie once, now you need to consistently lie in the future forever in appropriate ways that match up with that old lie. The more times you do this gets more and more complicated, like this giant growing tree of complexity. And then if you ever slip up once, now nobody trusts anything.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
It's one of the main issues I had with the system in general was that, like this possibility you could lie once, but then having it what don't you understand?
Well, I mean, okay, so let's say we agree not to deploy nuclear-armed Iskanders in Europe. I'm not going to lie about, I'm just going to not enter the location of my warheads in the database.
So if you don't enter the location in the database, then if we ask for the information later, can you decrypt or uncommit that one line where that information should be? Then you're violating the rules.
Like if we have like satellite imagery showing that you brought
violate the rules all the time. That's the problem.
No.
They're just not going to report it. But I think I'm not as sanguine about using satellite imagery.
Sure. But again, not perfect, but it's better. And, you stack up these things and hopefully it improves it.
But the way it works is that if they're noticing something through satellite imagery, then you can ask a question to the database, can you decrypt this? There's no way for them to have changed it.
No, but they won't. They just simply won't report it. And when you get the database, it'll say, well, we never moved anything there. And you'll say, well, we have the satellite imagery of this convoy. And they'll say, well, sometimes you need to bring more milk to the base.
Well, and that's the whole point about having discussions afterwards to figure out what is.
Well, but I mean, I guess I don't understand what it adds. I guess I'm trying to understand what problem it solves that I'm not already attempting to solve with satellite imagery and on-site inspections.
It simplifies things because you might not need as many on-site inspections. Because if you're entering something in the passport itself, and it's in that database, and it's secured with hash codes as we've been talking, then if you go back and ask a question about, hey, we noticed this so many months ago, then you can verify it.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I just don't understand what problem I'm solving. I mean, I don't see what I'm solving.
It's I don't know if anybody's online right now, but it's simplifying the verification process, which is what our goal is. And by simplifying it and making it less intrusive than it is right now, if you need less inspections, less inspectors on the ground, then it's a big plus. I think that's really the answer to the question.
But I think you have a point though, that it's not perfect. You don't have a perfect link between these things necessarily. If you do have a discrepancy that you can get away with, that causes problems. The details of how that gets caught and noticed and stuff like that, I think like Rose and Bill and Dan would do a much better job answering than me. So I don't think I can answer that question for you. But I'd be happy to have a conversation with you later with those people involved too. And I think as a group, we can probably give you a better answer.
I mean, I think
I'll
see Rose tomorrow.
Yeah, ask her. But I think it's about intrusiveness and non-intrusiveness and simplification.
Okay.
Okay, other questions? Anybody online ask any questions?
I don't have any at the moment with hands raised.
Well, I think if there's no other questions, I think we can.
Yeah.
So thank you very
Send me
much.
questions later too.
Yeah, of course. So thank you very much for a really interesting presentation, like covering so many topics. It's really, really, really cool.
Great.